Do you know the story of one of literature's greatest unsolved mysteries? A famous writer found delirious and dying on election day, wearing someone else's clothes. The master of detective fiction left us with a real-life mystery that has baffled historians for over 175 years. You've never heard the full story, have you? Let's discover together the mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe and the dark world of 19th-century election fraud that may have claimed his life. It was raining in Baltimore on October 3, 1849, but that didn't stop Joseph W. Walker, a compositor for the Baltimore Sun, from heading out to Gunners Hall, a public house bustling with activity. It was election day, and Gunners Hall served as a pop-up polling location for the Fourth Ward polls. When Walker arrived at Gunners Hall, he found a man, delirious and dressed in shabby second-hand clothes, lying in the gutter. The man was semi-conscious and unable to move, but as Walker approached him, he discovered something unexpected. The man was Edgar Allan Poe. Worried about the health of the addled poet, Walker stopped and asked Poe if he had any acquaintances in Baltimore who might be able to help him. Poe gave Walker the name of Joseph E. Snodgrass, a magazine editor with some medical training. Walker sent this urgent note: "Dear Sir, there is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, at Ryan's Fourth Ward polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears in great distress. He says he is acquainted with you. He is in need of immediate assistance. Yours, in haste, Jos. W. Walker." But to understand how shocking this discovery was, we need to go back a few days. On September 27th, almost a week earlier, Poe had left Richmond, Virginia, bound for Philadelphia to edit a collection of poems for Marguerite St. Leon Loud, a minor figure in American poetry at the time. When Walker found Poe in delirious disarray outside of the polling place, it was the first anyone had heard or seen of the poet since his departure from Richmond. Poe never made it to Philadelphia to attend to his editing business, nor did he ever make it back to New York, where he had been living, to escort his aunt back to Richmond for his impending wedding. Poe's actions and whereabouts throughout the next 5 days are uncertain. On October 3, 1849, printer Joseph Walker found Poe inside or near Gunners Hall Tavern. Snodgrass noted that the clothes Poe wore looked disheveled and out of place. He had evidently been robbed of his own clothing or cheated in an exchange. This detail would become crucial to understanding what might have happened. Edgar Allan Poe was known as a fastidious dresser, meticulous about his appearance. Yet here he was, wearing cheap, ill-fitting, dirty clothes that clearly belonged to someone else. Poe was found wearing clothes that were not his own. Poe was taken to Washington Medical College. He lapsed in and out of consciousness for the next few days, and according to Dr. John J. Moran, who questioned Poe about his condition, Poe's answers were incoherent and unsatisfactory. Moran also prevented visitors due to Poe's excitable condition. Moran later noted in a letter to Maria Clem, Poe's mother-in-law, that during a period of consciousness, Poe held vacant converse with spectral and imaginary objects on the walls. His face was pale, and his whole person drenched in perspiration. Poe died quietly before sunrise on Sunday, October 7, 1849. Moran reported that Poe's final words were, "Lord, help my poor soul," before dying on October 7, 1849. The great writer was only 40 years old. His death certificate listed the cause of death as phrenitis, or swelling of the brain. So what happened to Edgar Allan Poe during those 5 missing days? Because Poe was found on the day of an election, it was suggested as early as 1872 that he was the victim of a method of election fraud called cooping. Let me explain what cooping was, because it's one of the darkest chapters in American electoral history. Cooping was a form of electoral fraud in the United States by which gangs kidnapped citizens off the street and forced them to vote, often repeatedly, for an election candidate. According to some of Poe's biographers, so-called cooping gangs, or election gangs, working for a political candidate would hold random victims in a chamber or cellar and ply them with alcohol, or beat them to get them to comply. Often their clothing or other aspects of their appearance would be altered to fool voting officials, enabling them to vote multiple times. As in most major American cities in the early 19th century, election fraud was widespread in Baltimore. One popular form of ballot rigging was called cooping. A few days before Election Day, gangs of thugs roved the city, rounding up drunkards and the homeless. They furnished their captives with liquor and food and kept them in a basement or back room, like chickens in a coop. On Election Day, these hapless citizens were herded to the polls to vote, repeatedly, for the candidates of the party that sponsored the gang. There were no voters' lists. Balloting was done with color-coded cards, so there was nothing secret about it. Election judges, who were charged with challenging the qualifications of suspicious voters, were often bribed to look the other way. Let me give you some real examples of how brutal this system was. Cooping victim J. Justice Ritzman was looking for a laboring gig when he was lured by cooping campaigners during the 1859 presidential election in Baltimore. A member of the Pug Ugly Street gang offered Ritzman and other men a job, and then brought them to a bar. When fully drunk, they were led into a warehouse, where they came in front of a crowd of men, about 5 or 6, armed with clubs and guns and other weapons. According to Ritzman's testimony in court in 1860, the men were robbed and left in a dark basement, where they were given voting tickets for the Democratic candidate. He and the others voted 16 times that day. Peter Fitzpatrick, another cooping victim, said the gang dealt me 2 blows with a billy on the head and 2 on the knees to make me drink liquor, and after they compelled me to drink. On voting day, they and almost 80 other men were forced to one polling booth after another. Victims were described as follows. If they offered the slightest resistance to their captors, they were brought to their knees by blows from billies and clubs. They were robbed of every portable article on their persons. They were forced upon threats of death to swallow immense draughts of drugged and stupefying liquors. They were denied in some instances even the conveniences of nature, except in a most disgusting form. They were taken from the coops on the day of election and driven about to the different wards of the city and voted time and again without any seeming recognition or remonstrances from the judges of election. Now, let's look at the evidence that suggests Poe may have been a victim of cooping. October 3rd wasn't just an election day in Baltimore. Baltimore was a city rife with voter fraud in this time period. But the tavern was also a polling place. Additionally, Poe was found wearing clothes that were not his own. The out-of-character clothing suggests that Poe may have been forced to change his garments in order to cast multiple votes. On Election Day, October 3rd, Poe and his fellow captives most likely would have been roused and herded over to Gunners, where they would have been told to vote the Whig ballot. That done, Poe would have been sent back to his coop, told to swap clothes, and then herded out to vote again. The exchange of clothing was supposed to make it harder for opponents at the polls to spot the fraud. Poe's delirium has a few possible explanations in a voting context. First, voters in that era were often given alcoholic drinks as a reward, so Poe was possibly inebriated. Second, victims of cooping were often beaten to force them to commit voter fraud. The only specific cause of death ever listed for Poe appeared in the Baltimore Clipper newspaper, which claimed that he died from congestion of the brain. A beating could explain such a brain injury. English professor and Maryland historian William Han Brown asserted in an 1874 letter to Poe biographer John Henry Ingram. The general belief here is that Poe was seized by one of these gangs, his death happening just at election time. An election for sheriff took place on October 4th. Cooped, stupefied with liquor, dragged out and voted, and then turned adrift to die. But there's something that makes this theory even more chilling. Months before his death, Poe became a vocal member of the temperance movement, eschewing alcohol, which he'd struggled with all his life. Biographer Susan Archer Talley Weiss recalls an event toward the end of Poe's time in Richmond that might be relevant. Poe had fallen ill in Richmond, and after making a somewhat miraculous recovery, was told by his attending physician that another such attack would prove fatal. According to Weiss, Poe replied that if people would not tempt him, he would not fall. So if Poe had recently joined the temperance movement and was trying to avoid alcohol, being forced to drink massive amounts of drugged liquor by Cooping gangs would have been particularly dangerous for him. Many scholars find the Cooping theory very persuasive. In his 1934 biography of Poe, the scholar Hervey Allen called it by far the most probable explanation of what happened. Of course, not everyone accepts the Cooping theory. Some critics point out that Poe had many friends and relatives in Baltimore who might have recognized and rescued him. But as one historian noted, in the days before television and widespread photography, even celebrities weren't easily recognized on the street. And it's very difficult to explain Poe's strange attire in any other way. Over the years, many other theories have been proposed. A number of diseases have been proposed as possible causes of Poe's death, including diabetes, heart disease, epilepsy, and tuberculosis. One of the most intriguing possibilities, suggested by a doctor at the University of Maryland, is that Poe may have died from rabies. Poe's delirium seemed to get better and then worsen again over the last days of his life, a pattern observed in patients with late-stage rabies. Furthermore, Poe's hospital records indicated that Poe had difficulty drinking water. This may have been a manifestation of one of rabies' characteristic symptoms, a fear of water. In 1867, one of the first theories to deviate from either phrenitis or alcohol was published by biographer E. Oakes Smith in her article Autobiographic Notes. Edgar Allan Poe. At the instigation of a woman, Smith writes, who considered herself injured by him, he was cruelly beaten, blow upon blow, by a ruffian who knew of no better mode of avenging supposed injuries. But the Cooping theory remains one of the most compelling explanations. It accounts for all the key mysteries. Why Poe was in Baltimore when he was supposed to be in Philadelphia. Why he was found at a polling place on Election Day. Why he was wearing someone else's cheap, ill-fitting clothes. Why he was delirious and appeared to have been beaten or drugged. And why he died of congestion of the brain just 4 days later. It's tantalizing, says Amy Branham Armiento, a professor of English at Frostburg State University and a member of the executive committee of the Poe Studies Association. But despite providing over a century of fascination and frustration, Poe's death is still unsolved. Maybe it's fitting that since he invented the detective story, says Chris Sempner, curator of the Poe Museum in Richmond, he left us with a real-life mystery. The irony is almost too perfect. Edgar Allan Poe created the detective fiction genre with stories like The Murders in the Rue Morgue. He gave us tales of mystery and rational deduction. His fictional detective C. Auguste Dupin solved impossible crimes through careful observation and logical reasoning. And yet Poe's own death remains an unsolvable mystery. What makes the Cooping theory so disturbing is that it reveals the dark underbelly of 19th century American democracy. Votes were easily manipulated by gangs at the time. Voters' lists and pre-registration in the 1800s were hard to track by hand, and voting wasn't particularly private. Before the election began, voters would collect highly visible, labeled voting tickets for a candidate, stand in line, and give their tickets to a ballot officer at their local polling place. Often, it was impossible to figure out who had voted when or where, and some candidates hired gang members as voting marshals to oversee elections. Cooping was rampant in Baltimore, but it seems to have happened nearly everywhere in the United States. Witnesses of a fraudulent election in Boston later said that the election was carried out by violence and murder, and that politicians would bring gangs from New York, Delaware, Washington, and Alexandria to help win elections. What brought a halt to Cooping was that corruption in politics began to be more closely scrutinized by authorities and citizens. People also wanted to end voter fraud, and that resulted in police sometimes overseeing caucuses to ensure that a person did not vote more than once. In addition, Laws were passed to prevent voter fraud, and voters were ensured they could cast a secret ballot when they went to polls after voting booths were introduced. But these reforms came too late for Edgar Allan Poe. Poe's death devastated the literary world. He had struggled throughout his life with financial difficulties, personal tragedies, and inner demons. He had lost his beloved wife Virginia to tuberculosis in 1847, leaving him heartbroken. But by the fall of 1849, his life was finally turning around. He had received money for a new magazine project. He had rekindled his relationship with his childhood sweetheart, a wealthy widow named Elmira Shelton, and they were planning to marry. He was giving successful lectures, and his work was finally being recognized. And then, in one brutal week, it all ended. 5 days that remain a complete mystery. 5 days that transformed one of America's greatest writers from a man with a promising future into a dying, delirious victim found in the gutter outside a polling place. The master of the macabre, the pioneer of detective fiction, the poet who wrote The Raven and The Telltale Heart. He died alone in a hospital, unable to explain what had happened to him, calling out for someone named Reynolds, whose identity remains unknown to this day. His final words a plea, "Lord, help my poor soul." To this day, years after Poe's death, the reasons behind his visit to Baltimore, his whereabouts in the city, and the cause of his death continue to be researched and debated. Was Edgar Allan Poe murdered by election fraud? Was he kidnapped, beaten, drugged, and forced to vote multiple times before being abandoned to die? Or did he succumb to rabies, alcohol, a brain tumor, or one of the many other theories that have been proposed? We may never know for certain, but the Cooping theory remains hauntingly plausible. It explains the evidence. It fits the time and place. And it reveals a brutal truth about 19th century American democracy that we'd rather forget. As one writer put it perfectly, voter fraud was once common in our history, and sometimes deadly. We may never know if Edgar Allan Poe's premature death was due to voter fraud, but we can be thankful that such violent voter fraud will occur nevermore. The master of mystery left us with one final, unsolvable mystery. And perhaps, in a way, that's fitting. Edgar Allan Poe lived in the shadows between reason and madness, between the real and the imagined. His death belongs to that same shadowy realm, a mystery that will never be fully solved, a tale that will never reach its conclusion. So, did you know the story of Edgar Allan Poe's mysterious death? What do you think really happened in those 5 lost days? Was he a victim of Cooping, or did something else claim his life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and turn on notifications. In the next video, we'll discover another forgotten story from history. See you soon.